song. Yeah.
One of my favorite things ever is the those old AC/DC records that they're
Oh yeah.
in between standard and half step tuning.
Dude,
And
that blew my mind.
I was like, why would you tune your guitar that way? Well, I was talking to Francis about it. He's like, they were tuned into standard, or no, they were tuned in half step, but they sped the tape up because the song was too slow.
Right.
It's like,
That makes so much, and it also makes the singer's voice a little higher.
yeah.
So he wasn't.
Which also
he wasn't
makes
up
sense
there
because
all
that
the
shit
time.
is so fucking hard to sing.
It's crazy how like music works in depends on what time you create it, you know?
Oh, it's
Like,
very technology
it's-
dependent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, well, like culture too, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
how guys are developing their ways to think and everything, you know, that makes that song
The
at
moment.
that time. Like if you
Yeah,
take
yeah.
that song and put it like in another time,
The
it's not the same
I
song.
think
It's not
even
gonna
like-
sound
like
the same.
tonal, like guitar tones, drum tones. There's eras where it changes. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even
Like-
the frequency spectrums that the mixing side
Totally,
of it,
yeah.
and that Reggie Watts did a podcast for somebody, and he dove into that where in the 80s everything is really high frequency mixed, right? It's really
cocaine.
heavy. Literally, he was like
talking about?
they did experiments on rats, and like when they gave them cocaine, they responded better to high frequencies, and all of those mixing engineers were doing shit tons of coke.
It
back
was
then.
super bright.
So
Wow, that makes-
everything
that's
sounded
crazy.
super bright.
That's funny.
Yeah.
We were talking about that today before heading over. We were I was trying to figure out a riff, and I was playing the Nirvana, the teen Smells Like Teen Spirit, and he's like, I don't, what's up? Like in the '90s, something happened, right? And I was like, well, heroin, right?
Yeah, I said like when I started to play guitar, you know, like I started with Guns N' Roses, so I was like actually checking what I was around Guns N' Roses. But you eventually like come out with grunge, you know, because that was
After, right
yeah,
after,
that's
pretty
next.
much.
And it was like, what is this? You know, I was like 14 years old, and I was like, what is this? Like, why like everyone just changed like, you know,
Their
suddenly.
sound. That's why I was like,
Well,
the
that was
sound
like the
is
end of an
heroin
era, where it's
because
not-
Well, it's
Exactly.
that
if you hear
counterculture thing. Yeah.
if you hear the '80s stuff, like the sound, like now that you mentioned it, it explains that it's just this. Like you hear Van Halen, though that was like late '70s, but '80s, of course, everyone is trying to play like Van Halen. Early '80s, that's what I would consider a cocaine sound compared to like even the '70s and then later early '90s.
Yeah, well, you know,
slowed
this-
way down.
The 70s, the technology, there was no real digital technology yet. So the 80s is when digital stuff started happening. So 70s, they were still getting this dialed in, the analog stuff dialed in. 70s has a lot more warmer
Very.
oh yeah,
warmer tones and stuff, and the lower like speakers I don't think were as good then yet, so the low end like lower
lot of
frequencies
hum.
weren't quite there yet.
Yeah,
you know, like
exactly.
it was kind of got a little thinner, and in the 80s they were like all the digital stuff was like almost like basically like 8-bit technology, so it was like all this digital stuff kind of sounded wonky, but it was so new to them. If you listen to a lot of those 80s tones today with like keyboard, it sounds
yeah.
cheesy, but at that point in time, it was brand
was
new.
brand
Like
new,
that was
yeah.
just wild.
Even
sounding
like
shit.
Europe, like Final Countdown.
Yeah.
It's the with the
Da-da-da-da.
yeah, dude. That was like that's the sound of an era as far as rock is concerned. You hear even Guns N' Roses,
Let's-
Paradise City
Yeah.
has synth under it. You
Let's
can't really
jump.
hear it much, but
Van Halen. Yeah.
Jump.
Man, I always think of just like Prince, like Prince's
man.
tones, all that stuff was just. It sounded like it came from Mars at that point in time.
Yep.
That's true. Prince was like, yeah, he kind of started a lot. I mean, he got a lot of
Yeah.
influence. I know the way he dressed was Little Richard, right?
Right.
Right.
Well,
His all like the instrumentation and the sound palette was just wildly new.
Nothing like that back then.
Yeah.
That's why he became so huge. And he had a different ear, I'll tell you. He had
well, and how much of that is like due to the counterculture of switching because that like the 60s or especially the early mid 60s was mostly the like pop rock, I want to hold your hand sort of shit, you know.
that's
And
yeah.
then you got the Stones, and then you got the Who to kind of add a little beef to it. And then by 69, you had Zeppelin and Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you had all the proggy sort of huge rock bands throughout the 70s and the 80s. They were like, that shit sucks. We want a quick, catchy tune again.
Cocaine.
And they go through the whole 80s like that. In the 90s, they were like, that shit
Well, you know,
sucks. We want
and
depressing
like
music.
Every decade, there's a rebellion to the previous
Yep.
one.